Have you ever heard of a king who ruled for 28,000 years? Not 28, not 280, 28,000 years. That's not science fiction. It's not a fantasy story. It's a piece of real history, carved into stone thousands of years ago by one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. And that's just one king. There were others. Some ruled for 36,000 years, others for 18,000. Their names are written clearly, their cities listed, their reigns counted. You're not supposed to know this. Most people never hear about it. It's not taught in school. It's not mentioned in the news. But it exists. It's called the Sumerian Kings List. And what it claims breaks everything we think we know about time, power, and human history. This isn't a myth passed down through oral stories. This isn't a poem or a legend. It's a formal historical document created by ancient scribes, written in cuneiform, pressed into clay tablets, buried in ruins, and rediscovered by modern archaeologists who couldn't believe what they were reading. Let that sink in. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is an artifact, real, physical, ancient, that you can see in museums today. It has a name, it has catalog numbers, and it's not just one copy. Multiple versions of it have been found across ancient Sumer. They all tell the same story. Before the kings of Egypt, before the emperors of Rome, before the stories of the Bible. There were kings in Mesopotamia who ruled for tens of thousands of years, and after them came the Great Flood. Yes, you heard that right. The list itself is divided into two parts, before the flood and after the flood. Sound familiar? It should. Flood myths exist all over the world. In the Bible, it's Noah. In ancient India, it's Manu. In Babylon, it's Utnapishtim. Every ancient culture seems to remember a flood. But the Sumerians, they didn't just remember it. They built their timeline around it. 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. Then the flood came. And after that, the reigns suddenly become shorter, more human, more believable. Why? What changed? Did something or someone leave? Was there a shift in power or a change in species? These are the questions that burn through the silence surrounding this list. And yet, mainstream historians stay quiet. They tell us it's symbolic, that the numbers are exaggerated, that it's just mythology. But if it's just mythology, why record it with such precise detail? Why include specific cities, exact lengths, and individual names, all lined up as if it were a royal archive? And why does the list merge fantasy with real history? Because here's the twist. As the Kings List continues into later dynasties, the names of kings begin to match those found in other, confirmed archaeological records. Inscriptions, tablets, carvings, the kings toward the bottom of the list? We know they existed, so if the later kings were real, why assume the earlier ones weren't? What if the impossible reigns weren't symbolic, but a memory of something we can't yet explain? Maybe we're not the first advanced civilization. Maybe we're not even the second. Maybe there was a time when kings weren't men at all, when gods walked the earth, or something like gods. And maybe the Sumerians remembered. Maybe they wrote it down. The only way they knew how, so we wouldn't forget. But we did forget, or maybe we were made to. Because this list doesn't just rewrite history, it calls into question the story of who we are, where we came from, and who ruled us before history began. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Why would a civilization that gave us writing, law, and astronomy suddenly lose their minds when it came to recording their own rulers? Unless they didn't, unless they told the truth, and it just didn't fit the version of history we were taught to believe. This is the full story of the Sumerian Kings List, and once you hear it, you'll never see time the same way again. It was the early 1900s. A group of archaeologists digging through the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia uncovered a clay tablet buried deep in the earth. It was cracked, weathered, but still holding on to the secrets of a world long gone. They brushed it off carefully, and when they looked closer, they saw something strange. Cuneiform, tiny wedge-shaped symbols, pressed into the clay with sharp precision. The world's first writing system, older than Latin, older than Greek, older than the Bible. And the words it carried, they weren't just myths or prayers. They were names, cities, dates, reigns. It was a list, but not just any list. It was the Sumerian Kings List, a document so strange, so impossible, that the archaeologists themselves thought there had to be a mistake. Because according to this tablet, there were kings in Sumer who ruled for thousands of years, some for 28,800 years, others for 36,000. And this wasn't just on one tablet. More versions of the same list were found later, scattered across Iraq in cities like Nippur, Larsa, and Ur. Each one slightly different, but all of them echoing the same unbelievable idea, that before history as we know it began, there were rulers whose lifespans didn't belong to humans. Kings who weren't just powerful, they were something else, something otherworldly. The list was written like a royal record, not a myth, not a poem, a formal document stating the names of kings, the cities they ruled, and the exact number of years they held the throne. It begins with these words: after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. That one line changes everything. Descended from heaven. The kingship came down from the sky and settled in a city, Eridu, the first city. According to the Sumerians, this was the birthplace of civilization, the city built by the gods, the place where order began. And the first king of Eridu, Alalim, his reign, 8 sars. In Sumerian math, 1 sar equals 3,600 years. 8 sars means Alalim ruled for 28,800 years. Let that number sink in. And he was just the beginning. After him came Alalgar, who ruled for 36,000 years. Then Enmenlu Ana, 43,200 years. Then Enmen-Gal Ana, 28,800 again. A line of kings stretching across time like shadows, each ruling longer than most modern civilizations have even existed. And then, the flood. The Kings List says, then the flood swept over. Everything changes after that. Reign lengths become shorter, more realistic. Some kings rule for hundreds of years, then dozens. Then finally we reach rulers we recognize, kings that appear in both archaeology and written history. So what does that mean? Why would an advanced, organized civilization, the one that gave us writing, law, and astronomy, suddenly fill their official records with impossible numbers? Mainstream scholars will tell you it was symbolic, that these enormous reigns were meant to show respect or to glorify ancient ancestors. But that explanation feels hollow, because the list isn't written like mythology. It doesn't speak in metaphors. It doesn't tell stories of gods and monsters. It reads like a government document, a record of succession, clean, precise, unemotional, just facts, which raises an unsettling question. What if the list is accurate? What if, long before the kings we know from Egypt and Babylon, there were beings who ruled this earth for lifespans we can't comprehend, beings who were not like us? And what if that knowledge was passed down, kept quiet, and eventually buried? Because here's what makes it more chilling. Many of the cities mentioned in the King's List, like Eridu, Larak, Shuruppak, have been physically discovered. Ruins of ancient Sumerian cities, built with advanced architecture, found where the tablets said they would be. Even more, the flood that the list talks about, it lines up with geological evidence of massive flooding events in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE. That means parts of the Kings List match our history. The cities are real. The kings after the flood? Confirmed. So why do we dismiss the kings before it? Why ignore the part that doesn't fit just because it sounds impossible? Maybe it's because it opens a door we're not ready to walk through, a door that leads to a version of human history where we are not the first, not the oldest, and maybe not even the most advanced. Maybe the King's List wasn't just a record of rulers. Maybe it was a warning, a whisper from the past, telling us that once, long ago, something walked this earth with power beyond our understanding. and that power vanished, or was destroyed, in the flood. This section of the story, the unearthed clay, the impossible math, the blend of known kings and unknown ones, it sits in the middle of science and myth. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't try to convince you. It just waits silently for the curious to find it. And when you do, it changes how you see everything. Because if these tablets are telling the truth, then our history books are missing their first few chapters. Before the Great Flood reshaped the world, before Babylon, before Egypt, before even the pyramids rose from the desert sands, there were 8 kings. Their names are not famous. You won't find them in most history books. But according to the ancient Sumerian texts, these kings ruled for a combined total of 241,000 years. Yes, 241,000 years before the flood. Why? Why would anyone invent numbers that big? And more importantly, who were these beings? Let's step into that lost time. The story begins in a city called Eridu, the very first city of Sumer, and according to the ancient tablets, the very first city on earth. This is where kingship descended from the heavens. That's how it's written. Not born, not founded, descended. Almost like it dropped down from the sky. The first king listed is Alalim. He ruled for 28,800 years. Let that number sit with you. 28,800 years. That's more than 4 times the length of recorded history as we know it. That's older than any known civilization. Older than the oldest cave paintings. Older than agriculture. How can one being live and rule for so long, unless he wasn't a regular human? After Alalim came Alalgar, who ruled for 36,000 years. Then Enmenlu-Ana, 43,200 years. Then Enmengal-Ana, another 28,800. And the list continues with kings like Dumazid, Ensipasiana, and Mengalana, and finally Ubara-Tutu, whose reign ended just before the Great Flood. Each king is named, each reign is measured. This wasn't myth. This wasn't metaphor. This was a list, a record. But what kind of record speaks of rulers who lived longer than entire species? Even the most conservative scholars struggle with these numbers. Some try to say they're symbolic, that the years aren't literal, that they represent dynasties or family lines or cycles of power. But here's the thing. The Sumerians were brilliant with numbers. They invented the base 60 system. They tracked planets. They built cities aligned with the stars. If they wanted to say a long time, they had the tools to do it. They could have said hundreds of years, thousands even. But they chose numbers like 28,800, 36,000, 43,200. Precise, deliberate, not vague, not poetic. And if we zoom out, something even stranger happens. These exact numbers, these big impossible reigns, show up in other places. In Egypt, we find similar claims. Gods and demigods ruling for tens of thousands of years before the pharaohs. In Hindu texts, the yugas describe cycles that last hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. In the Bible, early figures like Methuselah lived to be 969 years old. It's like ancient civilizations all over the world remembered something. Something we've forgotten. A time when rulers weren't just men. They were different, long-lived, powerful, almost divine. And then the flood came. The Kings List makes a clear divide. Before the flood, impossible reigns. After the flood, reigns begin to shrink. Lifespans shorten. Kings become human again. It's almost like the flood wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a reset, a purge. Whatever these kings were, their time ended. And in their place came the kings we recognize. Ur-Nammu, Gilgamesh, Hammurabi. So who were these pre-flood kings? Were they gods, aliens, angels, fallen beings? Or were they advanced humans, far older, wiser, and more powerful than we can imagine? The Sumerians don't say much about what these kings look like, but their names still speak. Take Enmenlu-Ana. His name means Lord of the Divine Tablets. That suggests knowledge, command over wisdom, not just a king, a keeper of secrets. And Ubara-Tutu, the last pre-flood king, His name shows up in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He's the father of Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah, the man who survived the flood, built a boat, and was granted eternal life. That connects the dots. The same story untold in Sumer, in Babylon, in the Bible, keeps showing up with different names, but the same truth buried underneath, that before us, there was someone else. Now here's a thought that chills the spine. What if these kings didn't die? What if they left, vanished, hidden, watching? What if the reason they ruled so long is because they weren't bound by the rules of our biology? Imagine a civilization so old, so powerful, that they could stretch a lifetime for millennia. They didn't build pyramids. They taught others how to. They didn't worship the stars. They came from them. Maybe the Sumerian Kings List wasn't meant to confuse us. Maybe it was a breadcrumb, a whisper from the past, calling to the few who are still listening. Because if we take them seriously, if we even entertain the idea, then the story of human history doesn't start in 3000 BC. It starts much earlier, in a world before the flood, in the time of the 8 kings. Imagine a time when the line between God and ruler was so thin, it was almost invisible. A time when the beings who walked among humans didn't just claim divinity, they lived it. Welcome to ancient Sumer. Here, the oldest known civilization didn't worship gods hidden in the clouds. They believed their gods ruled on earth, in flesh, in form, as kings. But who were these gods? And were they really gods, or something else entirely? Let's talk about the Anunnaki. The name Anunnaki means those who from heaven came to earth. They appear in Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian tablets again and again, always described as powerful, radiant beings who shaped the world, gave knowledge, and ruled over cities. But they weren't just spiritual figures. They were said to physically descend, to walk among humans, to set up laws, teach writing, science, and agriculture, and most importantly, to rule. In fact, the Sumerian Kings List, the same record that told us about the 8 pre-flood kings ruling for 241,000 years, starts with a sentence that changes everything. Kingship descended from the heavens. Not chosen, not inherited, descended. That word changes everything, because it means these kings didn't rise from among humans. They came from somewhere else. Here's where things get strange. In ancient Sumer, the gods had names, and so did the kings. But if you look closely, many of those names start to overlap. For example, Enki, one of the chief gods of the Anunnaki, is also credited as the founder of Eridu, the first city in Sumer. But in the Kings List, the first king to rule Eridu is Alulim. Some believe Alulim was Enki, or perhaps a direct representative. Then there's Enlil, the sky god, who held command over earth and decreed the fate of humanity. The same Enlil is said to have appointed kings. He wasn't distant, he was involved. This suggests something shocking. The gods weren't just being worshipped, they were governing. And their rule wasn't brief, it stretched tens of thousands of years. Now here's where it really begins to connect with the bigger picture. The Kings List makes a hard split. Before the Great Flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, kings ruled for hundreds, then less. Why? Why such a sudden shift? Here's one theory that refuses to go away. The flood wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a reset, a turning point. Before it, the world was under the rule of the Anunnaki, long-lived, powerful beings who guided civilization directly. But after the flood, they stepped back. They handed power over to humans. The Kings List reflects this. The early rulers seemed divine, godlike. But after the flood, their lifespans shrink. Their reigns become believable, historical. It's as if the baton was passed from gods to men. Now let's go deeper into the mystery. Many researchers, including scholars and independent thinkers, have suggested that the Anunnaki were not mythological at all. They propose something radical, that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials, beings from another world, maybe another dimension, maybe another planet, who came here with knowledge, power, and purpose. This idea isn't just science fiction. It's based on what the tablets actually say. The texts describe flying ships, beings descending from the skies in flames. cities built according to star alignments, technology far beyond the time, and those same beings were worshipped as gods. Why? Because to a primitive civilization, any being with advanced knowledge would appear divine. Imagine ancient humans seeing a craft land from the sky. What would they think? A god, a star being, a divine ruler. Now imagine that being setting up laws, appointing rulers, and handing out the secrets of agriculture, architecture, and writing. It sounds impossible until you realize how advanced Sumer was for its time. Out of nowhere, civilization appears, with calendars, cities, mathematics, legal codes, all at once. Did the Anunnaki bring it? Were they not gods, not myths, but engineers of civilization? Let's not forget, this idea doesn't only come from Sumer. Across the world, similar stories echo. In Egypt, the first rulers were gods. In Mesoamerica, the god Quetzalcoatl was said to arrive from across the sea, bringing knowledge. In India, the ancient Vedas speak of flying ships, weapons of light, and sky-born beings who ruled the earth. The same pattern keeps repeating. First, the gods rule, then they leave, or vanish, and humans take over. Could these all be memories of the same truth? Now let's zoom in again. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence is the shift in kingship. Before the flood, the kings are almost superhuman. Their reigns are unbelievable. They seem more like legends than men. But after the flood, everything becomes human. Suddenly, lifespans drop. Dynasties change hands. Wars begin. It's no longer about gods ruling a paradise. It's about humans trying to manage what the gods left behind, and maybe failing. Think about it. If the Anunnaki really stepped down, if they left or retreated, what would humanity have done? They would have tried to carry on the systems, preserve the knowledge, imitate the gods. But over time, the memory would fade, the truth would twist, and the rulers would become just kings. The divine era would become myth, and history, as we know it, would begin. So who were the Anunnaki? Were they aliens? Advanced humans? Fallen angels? That's for each of us to explore. But here's what the ancient tablets tell us. There was a time before time, a time when the gods lived on earth, when they built cities, gave knowledge, and ruled not with myths, but with real power. Then came the flood, and when the waters receded, they were gone. But their names remained, their stories passed down, whispered across generations. And maybe, just maybe, they're still watching. The Sumerian Kings List is not just a list of rulers. It's not just names and numbers. It's a map, a code, a message, buried in time, waiting to be read by the right eyes. Because once you get past the surface, you realize this isn't just about who ruled. It's about when they ruled. And the answer may break everything we think we know about history. Let's start with a simple question. Why are the early reigns so long? 28,800 years for a single king, 36,000 years for another. That's not just strange. That's impossible by today's standards. Mainstream historians say it's mythology. They claim ancient people used exaggerated lifespans to glorify kings, just like biblical figures who lived 900 years. But what if it's not exaggeration? What if those numbers are symbolic, codes for something much deeper? Let's take a closer look. The Sumerian Kings List tells us that before the Great Flood, 8 kings ruled for a combined 241,200 years. Not 240,000, not 250,000, 241,200. Why that number? Why so specific? Now here's the twist. Some researchers notice that these reigns are mathematically perfect. Many of the numbers are divisible by 3,600, a sacred number in Sumerian cosmology known as a sar. To them, a sar wasn't just a random number. It was the time it took for Nibiru, a mysterious planet, to complete one orbit around the sun. 36,000 years. That's 10 sars. These weren't just kings. They were cosmic rulers, possibly linked to celestial events and planetary alignments. In other words, the Kings List might be tracking not just time, but cycles of the heavens. This is where it gets even more strange. If you compare the Kings List with Egyptian dynasties, biblical genealogies, and even the Book of Enoch, you'll see something strange. They all speak of a time before the flood, when beings lived for hundreds or thousands of years. In Genesis, we hear about Methuselah, who lived 969 years. In Enoch, we read about watchers, divine beings who descended to earth and ruled for generations. In Egypt, the Sumerian King List and writings of Manetho mention gods and demigods ruling for tens of thousands of years before the first pharaoh. So what's going on? Why does this idea keep repeating across civilizations? Different cultures, different regions, but the same pattern: long reigning god kings, a great flood, then shorter, human lifespans. Could they all be remembering the same forgotten era? Now let's go deeper. What if the Kings List is more than just a timeline? What if it's a mathematical key? Some researchers believe the numbers in the Kings List reflect cosmic calendars. The ancient Sumerians were obsessed with astronomy. They tracked the stars with incredible precision. They understood lunar cycles, planetary movement, and even precession of the equinoxes. So when they recorded these kings' reigns, maybe they weren't just talking about years. Maybe they were encoding astronomical periods. Maybe those 28,800 years weren't literal, but a way to mark a celestial cycle. Think about it. In many ancient traditions, time isn't linear. It's cyclical. A golden age is followed by decline. Civilization rises, falls, and begins again. Could the King's List be mapping these cosmic ages? And if we step back even further, some believe this could be hidden knowledge passed down from an earlier lost civilization. Atlantis, Lemuria, the pre-flood world. What if the Sumerians didn't invent this timeline, but inherited it? They may have been the scribes, not the authors. They preserved a memory of a time before memory, a record of those who ruled the world when humanity was still young. And the way they preserved it, with math, with symbols, with kings and numbers that make no sense, until you realize they're not just telling you history. They're telling you when the world began to change. And this brings us to the real mystery. Why is no one talking about this? Mainstream archaeology treats the King's List like a curiosity, a legend, a literary device. But they avoid its core truth, that ancient people were obsessed with time, with cycles, and with something that happened before the world we know today. They don't explain why nearly every early civilization speaks of a flood, or why the same pattern of long-reigning rulers appears everywhere. They just move on. But the ancients didn't move on. They kept carving it into clay, writing it in stone, repeating it across generations, because maybe they knew that one day we'd forget, and someone, maybe you, would need to remember. So now we've explored who these kings might have been. We've questioned whether they were human, divine, or something in between. And now we've looked into the possibility that their reigns weren't just made up, but encoded. Codes that track time, cycles, even clues from the stars. But we're not done yet, because the next mystery is perhaps the biggest of all. If the kings once ruled for thousands of years, why did their lifespans suddenly shrink? What changed? What broke the link between heaven and earth? Let's find out. Let's step back for a moment. We've followed the names. We've broken down the numbers. We've explored the possibility of cosmic timelines and gods walking among men. But now something deeper emerges. A question, a shadow behind all the facts waiting in silence. Not what the King's List says, but why it was written at all. Why would an ancient civilization, arguably the first, meticulously record the names, places, and reigns of kings who supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years, if it was all just fiction? Why go through all that effort to create a detailed document, on clay, with cuneiform, spread across generations, just to tell a fairy tale? Why did they preserve it, recite it, and pass it down like sacred truth? That's the question no one wants to ask. Because once you do, the world as you know it starts to shake. Let's be honest. This list, if taken seriously, destroys the modern timeline of human history. We're told civilization began around 6,000 years ago, that kings and governments formed after farming, that writing came later, with slow evolution from stone tools to cities. But the Sumerian Kings List says, number. Kingship was lowered from the heavens. There were rulers before the flood. There were beings who reigned for 28,000, 36,000, even 43,000 years. That's not a slight difference. That's a completely different story of where we came from. And that's why most people ignore it. Because if it's true, then everything we believe about the past is wrong. Let's imagine this for a moment. What if there was a time when the world was different? When humans lived alongside beings that weren't entirely human? When time itself moved differently? When lifespans were longer? When knowledge was passed from the stars? And then it ended. A reset, a flood, a fall from grace. That's not just mythology. That's trauma. That's memory wrapped in metaphor. And maybe, just maybe, the Sumerian Kings List was the attempt of ancient scribes to preserve what remained before it was lost forever. Still, the question remains, if it's true, why is it hidden? Why is it barely mentioned in schools, textbooks, or documentaries? The list exists. It's real. It's on tablets, in museums, translated and archived. But no one talks about what it means. You can find thousands of pages analyzing Egyptian pharaohs, Roman emperors, and medieval kings, but almost nothing about the rulers of 241,000 years. Why? Some say it's too strange, too unscientific, too impossible to take seriously. Others believe it's more than neglect. It's deliberate suppression. Because if people start questioning the King's List, they might start questioning everything. Our calendars, our history books, even the origins of our species. And once you open that door, you start asking things like, what really happened before the flood? Who were these kings? Were they even human? And where did they go? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary ones, because sometimes what you're not supposed to ask is exactly where the truth is hiding. Now take a moment and think. Think about how many ancient cultures speak of golden ages, of beings from the sky, of wisdom brought down then lost, of floods that wiped the slate clean. Sumer, Egypt, India, Mesoamerica, even the Bible. Different lands, different languages, but the same core idea, a time before time. So if all of them are lying, why are they telling the same lie? Or, what's more likely, they're all remembering fragments of a truth that someone doesn't want remembered. And here's something to consider. The King's List isn't just about kings. It's about power. Who had it, where it came from, and how it vanished. It shows us a world where power wasn't earned through politics, but descended from above. Where rulers didn't campaign. They were anointed. Where timelines weren't measured by decades, but by cosmic cycles. This wasn't just a list. It was a blueprint of the forgotten world. A blueprint that someone, somewhere, thought was too dangerous to destroy, but too powerful to explain. So they left it buried, in clay, in cuneiform, hoping no one would notice. But now you've noticed, and you can't unsee it. So what now? What does it mean if the Sumerian Kings List is true? It means our history isn't history. It's a version, a carefully edited script with pages torn out and inked over. It means we are not the first advanced society, not the first to build, not the first to fall. It means our origin story might not start in a cave or a farm, but in the stars, in floods, in fire, and the beings who once walked beside us might still be watching. But the truth is, no one can answer it for you. The archaeologists won't. The textbooks won't. The mainstream narrative won't. Only one question remains. Was this all forgotten myth or suppressed truth? The answer might be older than history itself and much closer than you think. If this shook something deep in you, if it made you question what's real, then you're on the right path. Like, subscribe, and let's keep digging deeper into what they tried to erase.